Welcome everyone to the United Nations Association of the USA's first online film discussion. My name is Rachel Bowen Pittman. I'm the Executive Director of the United Nations Association. Please note that this program is being recorded. Today's discussion provides us with another opportunity to acknowledge the UN's 75th anniversary and to hear from expert perspectives as we engage our communities in the UN 75th campaign to shape a brighter future. During the webcast, I will be joined by my colleague, Jillian Wilson, UNA USA's Communications Associate, and she will help moderate the program. And later in the program, we'll be joined by Jordy Hannum, Executive Director of the Better World Campaign, to discuss the UN's current role in Iraq. Throughout the program, please feel free to type questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be monitored by Jillian, and she will share as many as possible during the Q&A session. Today's session is titled From the Director's Chair with Greg Barker. And Greg Barker is a writer, director, and producer who is drawn to strong personal narratives that explore the emotional nuance and complexities of the world we live in. His award-winning films include the documentary version of Sergio, Ghosts of Rwanda, Manhunt, The Search for Bin Laden, and The Final Year. Described by the New York Times as a filmmaker of artistic and political consequence, Barker has worked in over 65 countries and holds a master's in international relations from the London School of Economics. He currently resides in Santa Monica with his wife and family. For a complete view of Greg's bio as well as Jordy Hannum's, please look into the chat box. I'd like to now welcome Greg Barker for our first online film discussion. Greg, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss your film, Sergio.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. This is a good way to spend a Saturday afternoon.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you're here. I enjoyed the film, and I'm sure a lot of others as well. And I'm just so curious, you know, it was such an important film because you featured a great UN humanitarian and also shine the light on the great work of the United Nations. So I'm just curious, what was it about Sergio Vieira de Mello that you thought this was a good story to tell?
Well, I never met him, but I happen to know a lot of people who did, and particularly Samantha Power, who knew him, of course, as a journalist. And when I first, she first met him in Yugoslavia. And, you know, there's something about the scope of his life and the both professional and personal that drew me to him. I really saw this as a narrative feature almost from the first time I encountered the details of his story and his death and the aftermath while Samantha was writing her book. I was reading chapters as she was writing them. And there was just something about his internal struggle, his ability to see the world in all of its complexity and all of its shades of gray, which in the course of my work, I had come to feel like that's where things actually get done. I'd kind of even then grown tired of the kind of arguments between right and wrong, left and right. I just felt like Sergio was a guy who retained his optimism, but saw the world in all of its complexity. And yet he didn't really see himself that clearly at all, and struggled with his personal life, and in a way sort of pushed it away. And there was just something in that internal journey of his that I found intriguing. Of course, you know, you never know what's going on in someone's head, but I found myself thinking about it a lot. And first told the story as a documentary for HBO, which is now on Netflix, which is great. And then, but I always saw it as a story that warranted, you know, a movie treatment. So it's great to be here all these years later and actually with the movie out in the world.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting how you had access to Ambassador Power's book as she was writing Chasing the Flame, One Man's Fight to Save the World, when you were, you know, putting together the documentary on Sergio. But what other type of research did you do to direct both films? So like, who did you talk to more about his life as, especially for his role as a special representative of UN Secretary General to Iraq? And then, you know, how did you get those individuals that were really close to him to open up to you and tell his story? I mean, it sounded, when I was watching the movie, there were just a lot of, you know, emotional moments, and someone had to open up and tell you what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, you know, I've worked with writers a lot, and in the documentary space and also in the fiction space. A book, the starting point, I have to then kind of do my own research. So with the documentary, I probably met, you know, dozens, 100 people who knew Sergio. I mean, Samantha would make introductions, and then it was up to me. You know, you have to kind of find the story. As a filmmaker, you have to find the story yourself. People, you know, it was striking. He was just one of these guys that left such a deep impression on people he encountered. Everyone from, you know, Condoleezza Rice and Tony Blair to, I remember so clearly, the security guard outside the United Nations Security Council, who was an Italian guy, who told me the story about how Sergio always took time to sit with him before addressing the council and share an espresso. And he remembered this guy's children, and they had a connection. There were hundreds of people who, probably thousands, who felt like they had that kind of connection with him. So in a way, you could feel this man sort of the reflection of his personality through the way that people talked about him. So when I came to make the movie, I had all of this, you know, you always have to do a huge amount of prep work to make a film that feels authentic as a director. But I kind of had done a lot of that, you know, 10 years ago, and was then able to share a lot of that, sort of some, you know, photographs and archival materials with the production team as well. So we could kind of, everybody could buy into trying to create this world filmically that was felt, even though it's, you know, it's fiction of this, you know, the actual story, but I wanted the world itself to feel real. And so it was, you know, it's in a way I'd done the prep work for it a decade before.
Yeah. And you know, how did you do the prep work of just learning more about the United Nations? I mean, I felt like you took us out on the field, and when watching the movie, and we were experiencing what it was like to be a UN official.
Thank you. I mean, I hope it felt that way, because I first encountered, I remember very clearly, like UN officials as a young sort of journalist, and it was, you know, Yugoslavia in the days just before it was breaking up. I was in Croatia and Slovenia. There's, you know, in those early days, and saw a lot of UN officials there, and then it was also in Iraq during the first Gulf War. And in the surrounding countries. I mean, met a lot of UN people then. I had a feel for the world, and then I spent a lot of time in Rwanda right after the genocide, and got to know a number of UN officials, from General Dallaire to people from UNHCR and OCHA who'd stayed behind, or, you know, during the genocide, and ended up making a film for Frontline called Ghosts of Rwanda, where some of the UN officials are key figures. So I just felt like I was intrigued. And of course, in America, we don't really understand the UN. And, you know, as Samantha always says, the UN is a building. It's easy to, only as strong as the member states allow it to be, particularly people in the Security Council, and as strong as its staff, you know. And as we all know, there's people who, you know, do great work in the UN, and it's also can be a bloated bureaucracy. It's kind of, all things are true. But I was drawn to the stories of courage and hope that I saw. So, you know, just in the course of my work, I was really, frankly, inspired by a lot of what UN workers had done around the world, you know, recognizing the failures and all that stuff. But it just struck me as such a force for positive engagement in our world that I found myself just going back to those stories over and over again.
Yeah. And I love the cast. What made Wagner, Moura as Sergio, and Ana de Armas as
Yeah.
Carolina the right fit for these roles? I mean, they had some great chemistry.
Thanks. Yeah, they're amazing. I mean, they're both incredible actors. I mean, it was such a great experience working with them, and people like Bradley Whitford and Brianna Byrne. The other kind of the cast was so, particularly as a first-time narrative filmmaker, to be able to draw on those kinds of talents was spectacular. Wagner, you know, actually from an early age has been interested in the United Nations, as it happens, and is deeply committed to human rights in Latin America, particularly in Brazil. So he was always, you know, I had the rights to Samantha's book from like 2011, 2012, and was slowly developing a project. Wagner was always on the top of my list because ideally I wanted a Brazilian to play Sergio, and you know, and then when he came off of Narcos, he was looking for a positive Latin, you know, role model to play rather than the drug dealer, and he kind of found, and he read Samantha's book, he saw my documentary, and we kind of found each other and connected. So that, you know, he was perfect from the get-go, and what we both in our early discussions, we both saw the world in a particular way, when I'm talking about these shades of gray, and realized we wanted to make a film that was really about empathy, seeing the other and understanding the other, and we kind of went from there. Anna was always our top choice to play Carolina. She came on board later. I mean, she read the script, she immediately connected with such a strong female Latin character, was determined to play the role. I think what's interesting about Anna is because she comes from a very humble background in Cuba. Her parents were not part of the elite, and she'd also traveled very widely as a young woman, just, you know, in Africa, backpacking, and had done humanitarian sort of work, I think with one of the UN agencies or relief agencies, I think in Mali, I'm correct, at some point. So she knew the world, she understood the world kind of from the ground up, which was exactly right for that character, but also right for the whole tone of the movie. We wanted to portray the world as it is, and not the way I think Hollywood often sees it, and to show that these are just, you know, foreign policy comes down to the lives of real people who are impacted, and change happens, as Carolina says in the movie, on this line, is change happens from the ground up, which I firmly believe. And our main cast, Anna and Wagner, kind of understood that intuitively. So they weren't just saying lines, but they felt it, and it kind of that spirit sort of really drove the whole production.
And Moura was also your producer, is that correct?
Wagner was one of the producers too. Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, there were two other producers who were more hands-on, but Wagner's role, which was key at the beginning, is I want to make a movie about a Brazilian diplomat, not a Brazilian drug dealer or soccer star. And we were able to, with his support and him attached, take that into Netflix and say, let's develop this idea. So, you know, yeah.
And how long did it take you to direct the film? And did you have any challenges that you have to overcome in making it?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And we shot for 38 days. That spread over about 3 months because we were on 3 continents. We filmed in Rio, obviously, and also in Jordan for all the Iraq scenes. Most of the extras in all those scenes are refugees from Iraq and Syria who wanted to be a part of this telling their story. And then in Thailand, we filmed all of the Timor scenes and also the interior scenes inside the rubble were actually on a soundstage in Thailand. So, you know, the big challenge was just organizing the cast and crew in such a, you know, far-flung production. And then really trying to make sure that it all felt as authentic as possible. And the Timor scenes were a great example. You know, we wanted to film in East Timor. Logistically, there was one production ever made in East Timor, an Australian film, and the producer of that told us, don't do it, because there was no infrastructure there. So, but we did the next best thing is we sent teams there, casting directors and costume and set people, and they brought back, you know, all the textiles and then we cast we had about 40 people from East Timor that we flew to Bangkok to be in those scenes. And it was really important for those scenes to feel, you know, to feel real, because you can't pretend you're in East Timor with people who are not from East Timor, because they have a very distinctive, and the people who were in those scenes, many of them were part of their independent struggle and had met Sergio and had met General Gusmao and or worked for them. And it was a really kind of charged environment, because they felt like they had a chance to tell their story to the wider world.
And did you have a group of former UN workers with you, or UN experts to help you along the way?
We had like one of the rescuer inside the rebel, Bill Von Zaley, was a technical consultant on set. We had some, in the scenes in Iraq, we had, or in Jordan, we had both the former UN officials and former US sort of soldiers and diplomats who were on set. You know, it was not an officially, we didn't like, it's easiest to do these things if you don't go, like, we didn't have the official sort of, you know, UN representatives on set, but we knew the world well enough to kind of make sure that we got things as accurately as possible. And when we walked in the UN, you know, the Canal Hotel set in Jordan, the interior in those hallways, and I had actually been in the Canal Hotel for real in Iraq before the invasion several times, and it was spooky, because it all felt, you know, all the calendars, the Post-it notes, everything on every desk feels like it's exactly from that moment in time. So it was, you know, that attention to detail that, you know, was incredibly important to the whole team.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if you know, but as a grassroots movement of Americans, we advocate for the UN, UNAUSA. So we understand why the UN is a vital organization, but what visions did you execute in the film so that those watching got the same message? Yeah,
it's important to me. And I think two things. I think I wanted this film to be seen by the greatest number of people as possible. So it's really it's an emotional, it begins as almost like a political thriller, but becomes this deeply emotional love story about how we see each other and see the world. And I think for me, that's, you know, probably a better way of reaching a wider audience than making a film about the United Nations per se, which I think people then kind of tune out. I in both my documentaries and my narratives, I prefer to kind of take the back door in and get people like to sort of pay attention to the underlying politics without beating them over the head with it. So I think if you make a film where like, we're going to show how great the UN is, people are like, you know, but I think showing, you know, a film about empathy and also how you can solve, you know, find solutions to very complex political global problems, which we certainly need right now, through Sergio and his team, which were really, he drew the best and brightest from across the whole UN system to be with him on all these missions. I think that's an inspiring story, and I think that's a story that people want to connect with. And hopefully, then next time they think about, you know, there's a debate on Congress about funding the UN or the World Health Organization, people might have a more nuanced, open-minded view after they've seen the movie. Absolutely.
So just to remind everyone, we'll be taking questions from the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So Greg, right now, I want to bring in Jordy Hannum. Once again, he's the Executive Director of the Better World Campaign, which is UNAUSA's sister organization. They engage policymakers, the media, and the American public alike to bring awareness of the critical role UN plays in world affairs and the importance of a constructive US-UN relations. So welcome, Jordy.
Thank you.
Great. Jordy, so Sergio Vieira de Mello had said that the UN's role was one that supports the Iraqis to replace the coalition and to recover fully their sovereignty. What is the role of the UN in Iraq today?
Well, I have to begin by directing my remarks at Greg and say that I was both delighted and disheartened by his decision to remake Sergio. As someone who read Chasing the Flame when it came out and saw the documentary when it came out and has traveled to Iraq twice and been to the memorial for Sergio, I'm so pleased that his story is being told again with an eye to a broader audience. Sergio's willingness to both speak truth to power, but also live in the real world that every UN diplomat lives in, where sometimes you must bargain with war criminals, makes clear how challenging the work is. But you also see the rewards in lives saved and improved livelihoods when those efforts pay off. And that's so important to show and tell, especially nowadays. That being said, every time I jump back into the story, it's just so soul-crushingly sad, Greg. Not only do you want Sergio to live, I find myself basically screaming at the TV for more help for Sergio and Gil as they lay under the rubble. Like he was there for 3 hours. But also the pain of reliving the just folly of the Iraq War and the hubris of the United States. I worked in Congress during the debate. I remember it well, how it was sold and packaged, and it's just so infuriating and tragic. So many lives were lost, not only Sergio's, of course, but other UN personnel, US soldiers, and so many Iraqi civilians. And almost 20 years later, to paraphrase from Samantha Power's imagery, the flame is there, but it's flickering and faint. So let me answer the question. I can say the UN has had and continues to have a vital role in the country. And let me also say that if you had asked me this question in 2017, when I first went there, I would have been quite optimistic about the future. I was there right after ISIS had been kicked out of Mosul and their caliphate had crumbled, and the UN was essential in that effort. For starters, before the Iraqi offensive against ISIS, the UN helped evacuate nearly 1 million civilians. That's the largest managed civilian evacuation since World War II. Once the battle in Mosul was underway, the UN's World Health Organization established field hospitals right near the front lines to help those injured. The UN Population Fund set up mobile delivery rooms so pregnant women could deliver more safely. The UN Refugee Agency helped millions who were displaced. And once the battle ended, the UN Development Program ensured that water and electricity were reestablished, and they rebuilt houses to ensure millions could come home. All this work was widely praised, and polling in the country showed real optimism for the future and faith in the government. So if you fast forward to 2019, I was there in December, just days after Iraq's prime minister resigned, chiefly due to the public's frustration with corruption and a lack of services. Needless to say, polls showed a huge drop in support for the government. There were protests in Baghdad and real pessimism about the future amongst Iraqis, with ISIS regaining in strength. But as noted, all hope is not lost. While it's not widely reported, security in the country has improved over the last 5 years. The numbers of hours of electricity each day have grown, commercial markets are opening, universities are setting records for admission. So much more needs to be done. But it should be noted that the same poll showing Iraqis losing hope in their government offered another piece of relevant data. Views toward the government and optimism about the future were more positive in areas that had seen greater reconstruction than those where it was lacking. And most of those places were where the UN operates and has supported projects. And we need to continue to invest in those efforts.
So Jordi, you're talking about more need for investment. On the US side, how does the US support the work of the UN in Iraq? And then what actual additional support is needed for Iraq?
Thank you. Yeah, US support is critical, but also checkered. No surprise there. So just in terms of kind of humanitarian assistance, development assistance, the US is by far the largest supporter to the UN Refugee Agency and World Food Program. Their assistance in Iraq is essential. At the same time, though, the US is trying to defund the World Health Organization and has defunded the UN Population Fund. Their work is also vital and has also been curtailed because of US restrictions. But I think the larger issue is really how we choose to allocate our dollars. So over the last 5 years, the US has generously contributed about $3 billion for humanitarian aid and rebuilding efforts in Iraq. While critical, it is a fraction of the $40 billion that the US has spent to send troops and provide training and equipment for Iraqi forces. And of course, that's separate from the trillions spent on actual fighting. So certainly from what I've seen and believe that we need to rebalance. I actually want to end with a quote, not from Sergio, though it could have been stated by him. It's from a recent letter to Congress by over 120 3- and 4-star US generals. They said, quote, "The military will lead the fight against terrorism on the battlefield, but it needs strong civilian partners in the battle against the drivers of extremism, lack of opportunity, insecurity, injustice, and hopelessness," end quote. And this is what Sergio spent his whole life fighting against, these drivers of extremism. And so we must ensure that we continue to fund and fight for what he sought most in Iraq and all the places he operated, which is opportunity, justice, and to live safely and freely.
Yeah. Well, Jordy, stay on for a bit because we're going to go to Q&A. Jillian, I see that we have some questions that have been posted, and once again, audience, feel free to add questions to the Q&A box.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you both to Greg and Jordy. The first question that we have come in is from Sophia. And Sophia asks, how accurate were the dialogues between Sergio and other leaders and politicians? Did you have to fill in the gaps, or were there actual records?
We had to fill in the gap. So for instance, it's a great question, with say, for instance, the encounter with Paul Bremer at the Abu Ghraib prison. We know that they went to Abu Ghraib together, that Sergio was trying to convince Bremer that reopening Abu Ghraib was a bad idea. But we don't know exactly what was said. The meeting with the Indonesian president, we don't know, there's no records of that. We know that Sergio went to visit him a couple of times, and after that, the president decided to apologize for Indonesian actions in East Timor. So, but within that kind of, we know there's an argument between him and General Gusmao, which we know something like that took place. And in fact, a lot of the extras, the Timorese extras in those scenes, say that they had heard much the same thing, but they always wondered what actually happened behind closed doors. So, you have to, it's a dramatization, it's a work of fiction, inspired by true events. And but we tried to be as, kind of as accurate and as plausible as possible, and it was interesting. So those scenes like with in Iraq with Paul Bremer, and this goes to what Jordy was saying, is like the kind of the hubris, the arrogance and the naivete of the early days of the occupation. Bradley Whitford is very interesting because, obviously his politics are very different from Paul Bremer's, but he brought a humanity to that role that I thought was really interesting, because you kind of have to see that these were well-intentioned but also completely misguided people who were in way over their head and just wouldn't listen to the Sergio and the rest of the UN team that had years and years of experience that they really could have benefited from if they'd actually bothered to listen. So we're trying to infer a lot of meaning into those scenes, but the dialogue itself we have to create.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is, how did you come to the decision to flash back and forward in time versus telling the story chronologically? Do you think the flashbacks made a stronger narrative?
Well, I do think it's a stronger narrative. I think we did obviously look at a more straightforward narrative. It's tricky because it was sort of everywhere, and then where do you begin, and how much do you then have to explain about, like, if you started the film in Yugoslavia or Lebanon or Brazil and tell his whole life story, or you started in Iraq, and then how do you explain where he came from and his backstory? So I think when we were ultimately trying to make a film about one person's journey, trying to understand themselves and the life choices that they've made, which for me was what resonated most deeply. it seemed that this that structure was the most effective way of dealing with it and unpacking it, because it allowed us to show parts from the backstory without sort of actually being there for whole sections of the film, which and now we had tried versions of that over the years, and each one of them had the danger of getting bogged down, and just, I mean, it works book, but in a film it's tricky to kind of go through when someone has been so many places and seen so much. It was, and there was so much drama in the explosion and the aftermath that I thought that was something that's worth spending time on.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is, why did you think it was important to show the relationship between Sergio and Carolina in the movie?
Well, I think, well, it's because it's always spoke to me as he was a guy who probably saw, as Samantha says in her book, I think, more war and human suffering of anyone of his generation, and yet remained an optimist and was able to, remain effective and not become cynical, and yet he didn't see himself very clearly, and clearly struggled with that. And I thought that that is something I identified with in my own traveled a lot and worked in a lot of countries in my younger years, and kind of, I related to the appeal of the field and the impulse to think what I'm doing in my work is so important. I don't have time for family life, and that'll take care of itself. And it was that kind of interior story that kind of just spoke to me on a deeply emotional level. So, and the fact that Carolina is then there with him in Iraq and down the hallway when the bomb goes off, struggling to get to speak to him through the rubble, all of which really happens, I thought was really incredibly powerful. And so, yeah, it was a choice that we made.
Great. Another question, what did you find most rewarding or most challenging working on this narrative film or working on the documentary?
They're both amazing experiences. I mean, with the narrative, it's for me very satisfying to be able to explore these kind of deeply emotional questions. What do you think about if you know that your life is hanging in the balance? The choices that you made, work and love and life. And I just think that's, a very interesting, dramatic situation to be in. You can't, but that's much more easy to unpack dramatically than in a documentary for lots of reasons. At the same time, the documentary was, it was a remarkable experience. I think what was common about both of them, there's something about this story that inspired the whole production team, both 10 years ago and on the movie, to kind of reach into themselves, work super, super hard. Something about Sergio's story, and then the love story at the core of it, and his empathy for the world really sort of drew out the best in the whole team. And I felt that spirit both in the documentary and in the movie. It was almost as if somehow there was something about that again, it was like the ripple effects of his personality that we still not just his personality, but his way of looking at the world that kind of infused both projects.
Another question that we have. I'm interested in the after story. What happened to Gil after he was so dreadfully injured? And have either of Sergio's sons followed their father into diplomacy?
Well, Gil Loescher, the figure is in the documentary. So in the movie, he's an amalgamated character in the movie. So sort of, if people have read the book, they can see where we've fictionalized his backstory. But Gil recovered and then went home to his family and taught at Oxford for a number of years. as I'm sure some people know, he was very ill in the last few months, and he passed away just this past week in Oxford. He'd been in hospital for some time, my understanding. So it's incredibly sad, and he was a remarkable, humble, decent man. All of us were really shocked by the news. Sergio's sons, I don't believe, no, they're not in diplomacy. They've done other professions, but I've not been in touch with them for a number of years.
And after working so closely to film Sergio, how do you think Sergio would see the UN today, and what lessons do you think there would be for the future?
I think he would feel like the UN. Wouldn't want to. It's striking in the middle of a global pandemic where we are, hungry for global leadership and for people who can find, navigate complex global problems. I think we need not just him, but people like him more than ever, and they need to be empowered by governments who turn to the UN and its incredible staff to help find a way through. I mean, it's not perfect, as we all know, and certainly Sergio knew. I think he'd be disappointed the UN is not as robust as I think it was. There was a kind of vigor to a UN-led diplomacy that we don't see so much now. I think that's partly because, the US, when you look at who replaced Kofi Annan, with all respect, it did not have the same kind of, the Security Council and the Secretary's office was not as robust as it had been. And I think, we've just seen a relative decline of UN leadership. Not to say that of course they do amazing work in the field, but it's not the same as where you have the UN, the Secretary General, who is a figure on the global stage who can really galvanize global support. Coffee, thank you.
And I just want to remind people, I see them writing in the chat box, if they can put their questions in the Q&A box, because we're not looking at chat. And I think Jordy is still on. So Jillian, if there are any questions for him to give Greg a break.
Yeah, okay.
There are a lot of questions.
No, that's true. Thank you. Someone submitted a question anonymously asking how, and this is for Jordy, how has the UN's role changed since the events with Sergio in Iraq? Has it significantly impacted the number of instances in which the UN enters dangerous situations?
Well, the short answer to that is no. So, I mean, there's a great scene in the film when Sergio first comes and the U.S. is set back and the troops are there and they're providing cover and Sergio says leave, and then that's brought back at the end. Spoiler alert, but it's the U.S., when it goes anywhere, it's Fortress America. It is a compound. There's a significant number of troops, and the UN always rejected that because it didn't want to look like it was setting, itself apart, that it was part of the community. And so in one way, in the places I've been to over a dozen places in like South Sudan and Iraq. And so now in the wake of that, the UN, it's not the US, but it will be set back. There is more security. But what is remarkable that I've seen is still the willingness for the UN to engage in a way that the US does not. I mean, I was just in Iraq in December. I mean, it was days after the prime minister had resigned. And it was a UN trip, and the US State Department was irate that we were going. They were, and while we were there, we came in and then we went right near Mosul. We kind of traveled all around, and you're just in a white Land Cruiser. There's no guards. If you were with the US, you'd have Marines front and back. You'd have guns that were obvious. Not the UN. Your car's armored, but nobody has guns. If you're in a situation, it's only the driver that's going to get you out of that. He's not armed. We traveled, all over, and we met with U.S. State Department officials who they were like, my goodness, you've been to X, Y, and Z. Tell us what it was like. And we were in one place, which was in the northern part, which at the time was quite safe, kind of the Kurdistan region, and met with U.S. folks who couldn't even, there's a coffee shop right outside their compound, looked like a good one too, and they couldn't go to it. I mean, this was like 10 yards, not even. They, the whole time, were kind of in their compound. And then you can imagine what that experience in terms of kind of understanding the situation on the ground. It was the UN that had a much better understanding of the situation on the ground. And there's still a much greater willingness to interact. So on that front, the UN is still, and that's not, I mean, that's in South Sudan, that's in all the places I've been. They're much more willing to go out, talk to people, kind of find out what the problem is. Sadly, they rarely have the resources that they need, but they still do go out there in a way that's actually much more, in a much stronger way than the US does.
Great, thank you. We have another question for Greg. Do you see yourself making more films focused on the UN, or in which the narrative has, where the UN plays like an integral part of the narrative?
I mean, I'm drawn to story, so maybe. Yeah, maybe. Depends on, but I wouldn't set out to make a UN film. There's an amazing story that I came across in Rwanda some years ago about the team of UN peacekeepers who stayed behind when everybody else pulled out. And it's a story that I would love to help get made. There's one of my personal heroes is this guy who was Senegalese peacekeeper for the UN, named Mbai Jang, who saved probably upwards of 1,000 people, including, I have to say, almost everybody in the Hotel Mille Collines. And Hotel Rwanda, with all respect, got that basically completely wrong. Those people were saved by a UN peacekeeper who himself was then killed and didn't live to tell his story. So that's a story that I think is kind of amazing, and maybe there's others out there. But I'm drawn to stories per se, and if it intersects with the UN and sort of a message I'd like to tell about the wider world, and that would be great too. But so no immediate plans, but maybe.
Great. We have another question from Joshua, who is dialing in from Hawaii. And he says, aloha, amazing film, and hope I can show students here in Hawaii. What was great leadership attributes or strategies of Sergio? And what do you believe were maybe a couple of his biggest successes?
Well, aloha, yeah. I mean, we all want to be able to go back to Hawaii again soon. I think leadership, drew together good people. He empowered them. This quality of empathy, which is so important, his ability to connect with people from the ground up. I mean, there's a scene in the movie which is based on a real encounter in a refugee camp, where he has this very deep conversation, almost mystical conversation in a weaving hut with a woman who talks about, he asks her what she wants for the future, and she wants to go up in the cloud and fall like rain on her homeland. It's beautiful, and it actually is. It's drawn from a passage in Samantha's book where a woman in a refugee camp in Central Asia says basically that exact same story to Sergio. He was able to take experiences like that and then translate them into policy, which is pretty unique actually, and to stay positive without any sense of idealistic, realistic, no cynicism. Pretty unique set of qualities, and galvanize people, to do their best and work hard for him. He was if you talk to people who and if you Google him now or look at Twitter, people who work with him are sort of talking about his different qualities, and it's all of this ability to connect with people and lead people through difficult situations. I've learned a lot from him personally, and just engage with others and get stuff done in the world. Yeah.
Why don't we take a couple more, Jillian?
Okay. There is a question from T, who I think is asking to share your experience with filming the scene with the refugee in East Timor when Carolina takes Sergio to go and speak with this refugee. So if you can speak a little bit to kind of the process for filming that and what that was like to direct that scene.
Sure. Yeah, that was a very special scene. That's the one I was just talking about the refugee woman who actually told Sergio a story about going into the sky and falling like rain on her homeland. So that scene it's set in East Timor. The woman who plays that role is not an actress. She was a school teacher from Dili, Timor, who we cast. We sent a casting director to East Timor to find somebody to play that role. It's a very key role in the film, key moment in the film, where Sergio has a kind of internal transformation and sees himself, sees Carolina in a different light, sees his whole mission in Timor, which up until then has kind of hit roadblocks. Sees out in a new light. Yeah, that was mostly filmed in a single take, where it was incredibly emotional for Wagner. We hadn't rehearsed it at all because we could tell that Signorina, for real, was not just saying lines. She actually, we found out later, had lost her family in the independence struggle, and the words were deeply personal to her, and felt like she was speaking on behalf of her whole nation. So, and you could feel that charged emotion. So sometimes with non-actors, it's best to, not let that out of the bottle until the cameras are rolling. So that's a real encounter, and Wagner / Sergio is deeply affected by it. And then so we just did a single camera where she tells her story, and then we did a reverse with him, and he's able to, if he's a skilled actor, recreate what his expressions and everything. But that hug and everything that he gives her was all spontaneous. And it just happened. It was a very, very, very real moment. And it was, you try to create a set where a situation on location in the set where magical things happen and authentic emotions come through. And that's exactly what happened there. It was in a deeply, kind of amazing experience. Nobody who was part of that moment will ever forget it.
Jillian, let's take one final one.
Oh, one more.
There are a lot more questions, Greg, just to let you know.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
There are.
You can always reach me on Twitter too, and I can answer questions too.
Yeah, let's take one more from the audience.
Okay, let me find a good last one here for you. Let's see. T is asking, I think you might have spoken to this a little bit earlier as well, but just to expand on, with this story that is so, well known, what other kind of challenges or obstacles did you face, whether it was in terms of finding locations for filming or working with, people who were close to Sergio? I think T's just asking if you can expand a little bit more on any sort of obstacles that you faced.
Yeah, I think I'll say, just broadly speaking, just to expand on what I said about the mood of the production, I was very determined to make a film that felt like it saw the world from the ground up, the way I think Sergio saw the world, And so the production team ended up being a kind of United Nations of filmmaking. I think one of our Netflix executives, they were incredibly supportive of the whole project, partly because they have such a global reach. The film's doing incredibly well in Latin America, and it's great to make a film for the world. But they were struck when they came to the location that we had, I think, 8 languages being spoken. Our my DP, director of photography, was Brazilian. Most of the camera team were Thai, even in Jordan. And we had just this mix of cultures and languages. The production designers, South African, costume designers from Greece, Crete, and it was just this coming together of people who saw the world in all of its nuance, and the way I think Sergio did, and tried to tell a story that didn't reinforce stereotypes. You know, we tried to make Iraq like not look dangerous. You know, a lot of times you see Iraq movies and they look dangerous because it's Iraq, so it must be dangerous. Well, it's also just people parts. Anyone who's been there knows at times it can be dangerous, but it's also just people living their life, you know? And I wanted to really, the whole team wanted to create a film that didn't just reinforce these negative images of we all see so often about war zones and refugees, and told a kind of story with its eyes wide open, and helped kind of break down barriers. And that's what was the most satisfying about it. And that came from, you know, I think for me, and also the whole production team and the cast, and this spirit of openness and empathy really infused the whole production. So that probably didn't answer the question directly, but in terms of the broadest sort of challenges and approach, it was just finding people who bought that and could bring incredible talents to bear to kind of create these moments on screen that would, you know, tell a story of hope and empathy amidst the darkness to an audience.
Yeah. Greg, thank you so much for being with us here today. And can you tell us about any upcoming projects or what's next for you? What should we look out for?
You know, I'm using this time to take this movie into the world and think about what's next. And I have various ones that I'm working on, but I don't think we'll be back in production on something this scale for a little while now, global productions. So, you know, it's a little premature, but I'm looking again, you know, these projects, I find the big projects kind of don't come around all that often. And when you spend 2 to 3 years on a film, which is what it takes, you know, you're filming for 3 or 4 months, but the whole production is really 2 years plus. It's you know, it's a big commitment, and I try to choose projects that I really want to inhabit for all that time. And it's not always possible to say, okay, this is the next one. It's kind of like I have to look very carefully for what the next one's going to be.
Well, I can't wait to see what you do next, because we really enjoyed the film. And I just want to thank you once again, as well as Jordi, for taking time out of your schedule today to discuss the life of Sergio Vieira de Mello and the impact of the United Nations. And I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. So thank you so much. And before we close for the day, I just want to bring everyone's attention to a few opportunities. One is UNA USA is hosting UN 75 virtual state consultations. This is your chance to provide direct input to the UN on building a brighter future through the lens of your community. So we are seeking participation from residents from all 50 states plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. So please join us for those. And then of course, if there's anyone participating today who's not a UNA member, I encourage you to join United Nations Association of the USA at unausa.org, or you can text membership to 738-674. We have over 20,000 members in more than 200 chapters across the country, and we do a lot of great work on advancing the UN's mission and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So please consider joining us. And lastly, please join our next virtual online series this Wednesday. And these sessions, we call them GEOS. They're designed to provide you with continued opportunities to engage UN officials and other global issues experts so that you can be better advocates for the UN when you talk to your elected officials or talk to people in your community about the great work of the UN. So Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us this Saturday afternoon, and I hope you all stay safe and stay well. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jordy.